If you are listening late at night, let the room settle around you. Maybe the hum of a ceiling fan, a curtain breathing with the breeze. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a Japanese summer in 1945, air thick with heat, the scent of tatami mats, and the distant clatter of a streetcar. There is a man on that streetcar. His name is Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He's 29 years old, an engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He has been away from home for 3 months, helping design a new oil tanker. Tomorrow he will finally go back to his wife and infant son in Nagasaki. Tonight, he thinks only of trains and suitcases and the small joy of returning home. History rarely announces itself before it arrives. The day before Hiroshima changed forever was, for the people who lived it, simply another day. Factories buzzed, soldiers marched, and families made breakfast as they always did. Above them, invisible in the clouds, the last stage of a global war was gathering: scientists, pilots, orders sealed in metal cases, and a weapon whose purpose few on Earth could imagine. When it came at 8:15 a.m. A light brighter than anything the sun could teach. And Yamaguchi was there, close enough to see the sky split open. Close enough to feel the first impossible wave of heat and sound. He would survive it. And 3 days later, when another bomb fell on another city, he would survive that too. This story is not about miracles or luck, though it may feel like both. It is about what a single human life can hold, what the world asks ordinary people to endure, and how memory itself can become a form of quiet resistance. So take a slow breath. Let the story unfold at its own pace. This is the life of the man who lived through both atomic bombs, and carried their memory for the rest of his days. Before the blinding light of 1945, there was an ordinary boy in Nagasaki. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916, in the coastal city that would one day become a synonym for devastation. In his youth, Nagasaki was a place of narrow streets and open harbors, where fishing boats bobbed against the tide and where merchants traded silk, coal, and the quiet ambitions of a modern Japan. He grew up among the sounds of industry, the steady hammering of shipyards, the whistle of steam, the optimism of a nation racing toward progress. Japan in the early 20th century was a country in motion, building ships, trains, and factories, its eyes fixed on becoming a modern empire. And for a young man like Yamaguchi, science and engineering were doors to that future. He studied at the Nagasaki Technical College, where mathematics met steel and where students learned to shape metal as though it were an extension of will. In 1939, the same year the world began to tremble toward global war, he joined Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, one of Japan's largest industrial giants, its factories feeding the empire's ambitions. There, Yamaguchi became a naval engineer, designing oil tankers, vessels essential for Japan's wartime economy. He was intelligent, meticulous, and by all accounts, unassuming. Colleagues remembered him as polite, soft-spoken, a man more interested in details than in politics. He was newly married to Hisako, his childhood acquaintance turned companion, and soon they had a son, Katsutoshi. By 1945, the war had hollowed out much of Japan's optimism, but Yamaguchi still clung to routine, the one refuge ordinary life allows even when the world frays at its edges. In the summer of 1945, he was sent to Hiroshima for work. The city was still largely untouched by bombing, a strange exception among Japan's war-torn towns. His task was straightforward: inspect a prototype oil tanker at the company's Hiroshima shipyard and return home in a few days. He arrived in late May and had been staying there for nearly 3 months. Every day, he walked to the yard, carried blueprints under his arm, and took notes on the vessel's design. He was eager to finish. The war was nearing its end, and so was his patience with travel. By August 6, his assignment was complete. He was scheduled to leave that very day, to board a morning train back to Nagasaki, his bag already packed with documents, a few clothes, and a gift for his wife. That morning, as he made his way to the shipyard one last time, he might have noticed the clear sky, the summer haze, and the faint rumble of aircraft far above. It was a Monday. 8:15 was only minutes away. He could not know that a B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, was already overhead, carrying a device called Little Boy, the first atomic weapon ever used in war. He could not know that within moments, everything familiar would dissolve into light, heat, and silence. And yet that is where his story, the story that would make him one of the most remarkable witnesses in human history, truly begins. It was, by all accounts, a clear and gentle morning. The sun rose without interruption, washing the tiled rooftops of Hiroshima in gold. Cicadas droned from the trees. Women prepared breakfast. The city's trams rattled along the tracks, carrying workers to their jobs and students to school. It was the kind of morning that seemed eternal, the ordinary kind that human beings build their lives around, unaware of history coiling unseen above them. Tsutomu Yamaguchi walked toward the shipyard with two colleagues, Akira Iwanaga and Kuniyashi Sato. He was thinking about home, his wife, Hisako, and their young son waiting in Nagasaki. He wore a white shirt, carried a briefcase, and clutched a rolled-up set of design drawings. At around 8:15 a.m., he had just arrived near the dockyard when he heard the drone of an aircraft. He looked up. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Hiroshima had air raid alerts often, but in recent weeks, few enemy planes had appeared. Still, a single silver speck was tracing a slow arc across the blue. Then, a sudden flash. A light so fierce, so absolute, that for a moment it erased color itself. Yamaguchi later said it was like the sun had fallen to earth. Instinctively, he threw himself into a nearby ditch, covering his head. In that instant, Little Boy detonated about 600 meters above the city's center, unleashing energy equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT. The world turned white. A shockwave, faster than sound, tore across Hiroshima, flattening buildings, shattering glass, igniting fires in an instant. Yamaguchi felt the air itself strike him. The blast blew him off his feet, stripped his clothes, and hurled him through the air. The heat seared his left side, face, arms, and the bare skin of his body. Then came darkness. A soundless, heavy kind of dark, where dust and debris swallowed the morning. When he opened his eyes, the shipyard was gone. Metal twisted like paper. The air burned. He stood up, stunned, his eardrums ruptured, skin blistered and raw. Around him, what had been a city only moments ago was now a landscape of flame and ruin. He stumbled toward the river, his mind a single looping thought: what has happened? He wandered through streets that no longer existed, calling out for his colleagues. Iwanaga and Sato were both alive though injured. The three of them made their way toward what remained of the Mitsubishi office, guided by instinct more than sense. They passed shapes on the ground, people blackened beyond recognition, shadows burned into walls, children wandering without sound. Yamaguchi's burns throbbed, but he pressed on. At one point, he saw a young woman staring into a puddle, as if trying to drink, though her reflection was gone. He looked away. The human mind has its own mercy, the ability to turn from what it cannot bear. By late afternoon, the fires had begun to merge into one continuous blaze. He found shelter in a half-collapsed air raid trench. His skin was blistered, his hair singed, his hearing gone in one ear. He spent the night there, half-conscious, the world glowing red above him. In the morning, the three men decided to leave Hiroshima. They needed to return to Nagasaki, where their families lived. Somehow, through a landscape of ruin, they reached the railway station, a building without walls but still, miraculously, standing. Trains were running again by the next day, the Japanese railway system forcing order upon the unthinkable. Yamaguchi boarded one. He was wrapped in bandages, trembling from fever, his skin raw with radiation burns. He thought of home, of Hisako, of the son who did not yet know what the word atomic meant. He did not yet realize that the worst was still waiting. For in 3 days' time, in a city he called home, the sky would open once more. The hours after the blast were a kind of twilight. Not day, not night, but a strange, glowing dust that seemed to settle over Hiroshima like a second skin. Dust hung in the air so thick it dimmed the sun. And through that haze thousands of people moved without direction, their bodies burned, their voices hoarse, their minds adrift. Tsutomu Yamaguchi stumbled through this new world. He had survived the initial explosion, but survival was only the beginning. He was bleeding, his skin swollen and blistered, his eardrums ruptured. Every breath felt sharp, metallic, as if the air itself had changed. He searched the flattened streets for his colleagues, calling their names through the dust. Somewhere near the Mitsubishi yard, he found them, Iwanaga and Sato, both burned, both dazed but alive. Together, they began moving toward what they thought might be safety. They didn't yet understand that there was no safe place left. As they moved, the scale of destruction began to emerge. Entire neighborhoods erased. Rivers choked with debris and bodies. Fires blooming like red flowers across the horizon. The heat was still intense enough to scorch the soles of their feet through their shoes. In one surviving building, a concrete structure on the outskirts of the city, they found shelter. Someone had turned the space into an impromptu aid station. No doctors, no medicine, only bandages torn from sheets and bowls of muddy water fetched from nearby wells. Yamaguchi sat among hundreds of wounded, his body trembling with shock. The smell of burned flesh mixed with smoke and dust, a scent he would remember for the rest of his life. That night, under a sky that flickered with distant fires, he tried to rest. He thought of Nagasaki, his wife, Hisako, and their little boy. He wondered if they were safe. He had no way to tell them he was still alive. In the early morning of August 7th, with what strength they had left, Yamaguchi and his colleagues began the long journey home. Somehow, amidst the chaos, the trains were running again, damaged, but functional. Railway workers had cleared enough of the tracks to allow a few departures. They boarded one bound for Nagasaki, carrying with them a story that no one could yet believe. The train passed through a countryside untouched by fire. Passengers stared at the 3 men wrapped in rags, their skin bandaged and faces blistered. When Yamaguchi told them, quietly, what had happened in Hiroshima, some shook their heads in disbelief. Others fell silent. As the train rattled westward, he looked out at the green hills and rivers. He had seen what the end of the world might look like, and now, impossibly, life beyond the windows went on as though nothing had changed. Crows flew, rice paddies shimmered in the sun, and farmers bent to their work. The contrast was unbearable and unreal. By evening, he reached Nagasaki. The air smelled of the sea again. His wife was waiting, her eyes wide as she saw the state he was in. He told her, haltingly, feverishly, that a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. She listened, unable to comprehend what such a thing could mean. How could one weapon erase an entire city? That night she tended his burns and changed his bandages. For the first time in days he slept under his own roof. He did not know that another bomber was already being prepared, far to the south. And that within 72 hours, the unimaginable would find him again. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi arrived back in Nagasaki, the city seemed untouched by the war's new kind of ruin. Factories still worked. Streetcars still clattered through narrow roads. Children still ran between market stalls. It felt almost peaceful, as if the violence that had consumed other cities would spare this one. He reached his home in the Urakami district, and Hisako met him at the door. Her hands flew to her mouth when she saw his bandaged face, the burns along his arms, the raw patches of skin that glistened beneath the cloth. He told her everything, how the sky had turned to fire, how people vanished in the light, how Hiroshima itself had ceased to exist. But his voice was soft, fevered. The words sounded like madness. Hisako tended to him through the night, applying salve to his burns, cooling his fever with damp cloths. Their small son, Katsutoshi, watched silently, clutching a wooden toy. Outside, the neighborhood went on as usual, neighbors calling, factory horns echoing at dawn. By August 8th, Yamaguchi's sense of duty stirred him from bed. Despite his wounds, he decided to report back to his office at Mitsubishi. It was the Japanese way, order above all things. He felt he owed it to his colleagues to inform them of what he had seen, to warn them that something beyond imagination had entered the world. He arrived at the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki swathed in bandages. Coworkers stared as he stepped through the door, pale and trembling. His supervisor looked up, astonished, and asked what had happened. Yamaguchi told him plainly, "Hiroshima has been destroyed by a single bomb." The supervisor frowned, almost offended. "That's impossible," he said. "You must be mistaken." Yamaguchi tried to explain, the blinding flash, the wind that leveled everything, the fires that burned without fuel. He was still speaking, still describing the light over Hiroshima, when another light would soon fill the sky. This one over Nagasaki. The morning of August 9, 1945, began like any other in Nagasaki. The sun rose clear over the mountains, and the harbor shimmered in the early light. Men walked to work with lunch boxes tucked under their arms. Women swept their doorsteps, chatting softly over low fences. Children ran laughing toward the schools that still stood, untouched by war. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, it was the first morning he had felt strong enough to return to duty. His burns itched beneath fresh bandages, and every movement stung, but he told himself that life must go on. That was how one endured, by carrying on quietly even when the world had burned behind you. At the Mitsubishi shipyard office, he took his seat with two other engineers. The conversation was subdued but polite. They spoke of supply shortages, of rumors about the Soviets, of the Emperor's silence. None of them imagined that they were only minutes away from the second act of the same catastrophe. Around 11 a.m., the air grew oddly still. A siren wailed, another air raid warning, but such alarms had become routine. Few people took shelter anymore. The B-29 bombers that flew overhead rarely struck Nagasaki. The city's narrow valleys and heavy cloud cover often hid it from view. Yamaguchi sat near a window, finishing a sketch when the light changed. He would later say it was identical to what he'd seen 3 days earlier, that same searing white brilliance that turned every surface to glass. He barely had time to shout, "Get down!" before the windows imploded inward. The building buckled. He threw himself to the floor as the shockwave tore through the room, shredding paper, splintering wood, hurling glass across desks like rain. Once again, he felt the air itself explode against him, that crushing, rolling wave that had flattened Hiroshima. For the second time in less than a week, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was at the center of an atomic blast. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, had detonated over the Urakami Valley, less than 2 miles from where he stood. The sound came after the light, a deep, rolling thunder that went on for what felt like minutes. He covered his ears, pressed his face to the floor, and waited for the world to stop shaking. When the tremors faded, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the moans of the injured. He stood dazed, his burns reopened, his body trembling with disbelief. He looked through what had been the window, now only a jagged frame, and saw a city he could not recognize. A towering column of smoke rose over the valley, shaped like a monstrous mushroom. The air shimmered with heat and dust. He thought of Hisako and their son, back in the Urakami district, the very center of the blast. Without a word, he staggered from the ruins and began to run. Outside, the streets were chaos. Telephone poles lay scattered like matchsticks. Walls had collapsed, roofs had vanished, fires leapt from house to house. The people who could still move wandered aimlessly, their skin blackened and peeling. The city he had walked through that morning was gone. Yamaguchi's lungs burned as he called out for his family. Each step through the wreckage tore at his feet, his wounds, his mind. He reached what remained of his home, or where it had been. The neighborhood was flattened, smoldering, unrecognizable. He shouted until his voice broke. Then, through the smoke, he saw them. Hisako and little Katsutoshi were crouched in a drainage ditch, covered in soot but alive. Moments before the bomb fell, she had left the house to search for burn ointment for her husband's injuries. That errand, a simple act of care, had saved both their lives. He fell to his knees beside them, shaking, weeping, overwhelmed. They were alive. Again. As afternoon gave way to evening, rain began to fall, dark, oily rain that left stains on skin and clothing. The survivors huddled together beneath the broken eaves of what was left of their homes, too numb to comprehend what had happened. 2 cities, 2 sons, 1 man who had seen them both. Yamaguchi did not yet know he was the only known person to survive both atomic bombings. At that moment, he was simply a husband and a father, alive in a world that kept trying to die. For days after the second explosion, Tsutomu Yamaguchi wandered through Nagasaki in a haze of disbelief. He had seen 2 cities die, yet he still breathed. Every direction he turned, the world was unrecognizable, as though the earth itself had decided to erase the memory of human effort. The Urakami district was a scorched bowl of ash. The cathedral, once the largest in East Asia, had collapsed into a pile of red bricks. The air carried the same metallic scent he remembered from Hiroshima. The smell of burned stone, flesh, and dust mingled into one. The rain that followed the blast, thick and oily, had left black stains on every surface it touched. Yamaguchi tried to help where he could. He tore cloth into bandages. He fetched water for the wounded. He joined neighbors in digging through rubble, calling out for anyone still alive. But there were fewer voices each day. At night, he returned to what was left of his home, little more than a frame of wood and scorched earth. Hisako tended to his reopened burns, her own arms streaked with soot. Their son coughed in his sleep, his body fragile from the smoke and dust. Each breath of air felt heavy, poisoned by what had fallen from the sky. In those nights of silence, when the fires had burned low, Yamaguchi tried to make sense of what had happened. He was an engineer, a man who understood machines, equations, the logic of metal and structure. But there was no formula that could explain the sight of 2 cities obliterated by a single weapon each. He remembered the blinding light, the flash that turned human shadows to charcoal outlines on walls. He remembered the cries of those who wandered, skin peeling, eyes searching for water. And then he thought of the men who had built the bomb, scientists somewhere, proud perhaps, believing they had achieved something extraordinary. He wondered what they would think if they saw what he had seen. Would they still call it victory? Food was scarce. Water ran foul. Yamaguchi and his family lived on small rations of rice and sweet potatoes. Each morning new columns of smoke rose from funeral pyres built in the ruins. The dead could not all be buried, so the air itself became the cemetery. Still, There were moments of strange beauty. A persimmon tree that somehow survived the blast began to sprout green leaves. A small cat returned to the ruins and mewed for food. In the distance, fishermen cast their nets into the bay again, as though nothing had changed. These small signs, life persisting where none should, gave Yamaguchi a kind of fragile peace. He began to write down what he had seen, recording every detail while it was still clear in his mind. Perhaps, he thought, someday someone would need to know. Perhaps the story of one man's survival could serve as proof that humanity must never walk this path again. As September came, word spread that Japan had surrendered. The emperor's voice, broadcast over radio, sounded calm and distant. Endure the unendurable. For Yamaguchi, endurance was not an idea, it was the only thing left. He had endured 2 suns that fell from the sky, and somehow, the long night after them. After the immediate chaos, Tsutomu Yamaguchi and his family faced a long, slow recovery. The burns on his body healed only partially. Some scars would remain for the rest of his life, reminders not of a battle, but of 2 cities flattened by human hands. The hospital was overwhelmed. Doctors did what they could with limited supplies, but the invisible enemy, radiation, lingered long after the fires died. Hisako tended to him daily, carefully dressing wounds and soothing fevered nights. She carried the weight of the entire household alone at times, supporting her husband and their child in a city that had to rebuild itself from ash. Many friends and neighbors were gone, yet the small community that remained clung together, forming bonds of quiet survival. For decades, Yamaguchi did not speak publicly about what had happened. He lived a life that seemed ordinary, returning to Mitsubishi, raising his son, maintaining a household. Yet inside he carried a profound knowledge that few could understand. 2 atomic bombs had fallen, and he had been in the heart of both. The probability of survival was vanishingly small, and yet here he was, alive, walking, breathing, remembering. It was only later, after the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had settled into history books and museum exhibits, that Yamaguchi began to speak. At first, to colleagues, then in small interviews with journalists, and eventually in lectures to schoolchildren. He described what it felt like to be in the white flash, to be lifted and thrown, to see shadows burned into stone, to wander through streets where life and death hung side by side. He emphasized the human cost, never the political. He spoke softly, measuredly, ensuring that those who listened understood the gravity without succumbing to sensationalism. It was not heroism, he once said. It was survival. And survival carries responsibility. Yamaguchi also confronted the invisible aftermath, radiation sickness. He and many survivors experienced nausea, fatigue, hair loss, and a constant awareness of mortality. He lived with the knowledge that the bomb's effects were not only immediate but enduring, a slow, silent shadow across decades. Despite this, he became a quiet advocate for peace. He traveled internationally, speaking to students and diplomats, always gentle, never shouting, never seeking fame. His message was simple: humanity must not repeat the mistakes of 1945. He reminded listeners that weapons of such scale do not discriminate. They erase everything ordinary and extraordinary alike. In the later years of his life, Yamaguchi reflected often on what it meant to survive. It was a strange, almost unbearable gift, to live when so many had not, to carry memory that others could not bear to carry, and to find a reason to continue each day. He embraced these years quietly, working, teaching, laughing softly with family, carrying the weight of history in the steady calm of a life rebuilt. By the time he reached his 70s, the world knew his story. Not as a tale of miraculous luck, but as a witness to the unimaginable. His testimony became a bridge, connecting future generations to the reality of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to the human consequences of choices made in the pursuit of war. And through it all, he remained measured, calm, reflective, the same man who had stepped onto that morning train in August 1945, now decades older, carrying the quiet wisdom of survival. The story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi is not only a story of survival, it is a mirror held up to history itself. He lived through 2 atomic bombings, yet he never framed his experience as a tale of heroism. Instead, he offered memory, careful, measured, almost sacred. Yamaguchi often spoke of the shadows left behind in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the imprints of people, frozen in stone and ash. He reminded listeners that the dead were not statistics, that cities were not merely coordinates on a map, and that the human cost of war defies comprehension. For him, remembrance was ethical, a duty to the past, a caution to the future. Historians note that atomic warfare transformed not only military strategy but the moral framework of conflict. The bombs were an invention that rendered traditional rules of engagement meaningless. Yamaguchi's testimony, calm yet precise, forced the world to confront questions that are still debated today. What is acceptable in war? How do we measure necessity against human cost? And most profoundly, what does it mean to survive when so many others do not? In interviews, Yamaguchi would emphasize ordinary human life, children, mothers, office workers, neighbors. The people who died were people like us, he would say. The city did not survive. The city's memory survives through us. In this way, he became more than a survivor. He became a bridge between human experience and historical truth. Even in death, Yamaguchi's life serves as a meditation. He died in 2010, at the age of 93, having outlived almost all who shared his rare fate. His calm voice, his quiet insistence on memory, and his dedication to truth remain a lesson that history is not only events and dates, but the lived, trembling, fragile experience of individuals. Through him, we see that survival carries responsibility. To remember. To teach. To carry forward a story so that the light of those lost is never extinguished. Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life reminds us that history is not only made in cities and governments, but in the fragile, beating hearts of individuals. He was an ordinary man thrust into extraordinary circumstances, twice touched by a force beyond imagination. Yet he carried on, not as a hero, not as a legend, but as a human being navigating the aftermath of the unimaginable. We can imagine him, late at night, walking quietly along the streets of Nagasaki. The stars above untouched by fire, the river reflecting soft moonlight, his son sleeping peacefully beside him, his wife tending the home. A world that continued to turn, even after the sky had burned. And in those quiet hours, Yamaguchi did what he had always done. He remembered. He remembered the people whose voices were lost to the blast, the children who vanished before they could laugh, the ordinary faces frozen in extraordinary light. He remembered not with anger, but with solemn clarity. His life became testimony, a living archive of both human fragility and human endurance. There is a profound lesson in survival. It is not simply to breathe, or to endure pain, or to evade death. It is to carry memory with care, to act as witness, to live with humility in the shadow of forces beyond our control. Yamaguchi's life was a quiet insistence that we never forget. That in the echo of those atomic suns, there is a call to conscience, a plea for compassion, and a reminder of what it truly means to be human. As night falls where you listen, let your mind drift gently. Picture the soft streets of Nagasaki, the wind brushing over rooftops, the calm after a storm too immense to imagine. Remember that history is not only a story of destruction, but also a story of life persisting against all odds. And in that persistence, in the quiet resilience of one man, we find something timeless, the fragile, enduring spark of humanity. Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived twice through the unimaginable, and yet, he carried the world forward quietly, softly, like a candle in the wind. May his story linger in your mind tonight, a meditation on survival, memory, and the delicate threads that connect us all.